You're listening to Many Lumens, where we talk about and find meaning in the intersections of art, social change, and popular culture. I'm your host, Maori Karmael Holmes. In this conversation, I'm joined by Blitz Bazawule, the musician, filmmaker, writer, and painter. We discuss the Black Atlantic and Kwame Nkrumah, moving to Middle America from Ghana, finding a creative tribe, and working across mediums, including film, the form perhaps best able to capture the many dimensions of Afro-diasporic storytelling. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this show, as I know that you have a really busy schedule, and we really, really appreciate participating in this first podcast of ours. You are our last interview in this pilot season, so it's also really nice to be celebrating today that we did this. There, of course, is a lot going on in Philadelphia and, just in the world, period, right now. So I want to take some time to kind of acknowledge that. But yeah, just very much gratitude for you agreeing to do this.
It's a pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. Big pleasure.
What or whom gave you permission to consider yourself an artist?
And I will say first, my mother, grandmother, they were the first artists I knew, in whatever pure sense of that word is, just the ability to create, the ability to use your imagination, to bring forth a world. And my grandmother was a master of that. And my mother continued that, for us growing up. And, I never grew up with an idea that art was one specific thing. For me, the way my mother got ready for church on Sunday was art. The way that somehow, without having a lot, we could have so much on our plates was art, and, the stories that were told, whether they were domestic stories or world building stories like my grandmother would tell, that was art, the way family would show up on the weekend and they'll play music on vinyl and dance was art. So looking at that, I've always, that would be my first purest idea of what art is, and permission to participate, because that was another thing. We were never kind of kept out. The kids run around while all of this was happening. And so we witnessed it. We were never on the outs of any of it. And so, yeah, I will say that is kind of that was my permission.
I want to fast forward a little bit from growing up into, you broke out as a musician in 2000 as a featured guest on a song called Diva. Our researcher went really deep in the archives and found the video clip, which was really great. And I noticed that your name at that time was Bizarre. And yeah. I was curious, how did you come to that name? And then how did that evolve into Blitz?
Yeah, Bazawule was just the first four letters of my last name. It was just Baza, right? And then they kind of added the ER at some point. I had nothing to do with that. But that was like my, probably like my first real recording. And I have to deeply salute and send love to a brother called Hama. Hama was the first person to say, hey, you should record at my studio. And that song actually became quite a big song. And I remember at that time we were going through kind of a political election moment in the country. And I remember some of the political parties using that song as kind of their anthems at the time. So it was a big deal. We also won like Best New Artist in Ghana off that record. And so it was very early. I had no idea what the business was. I had no idea even if I was going to be an artist for a living. But I did know that it was something special. And when I did move to the United States at the time, I'm sure a lot of people know D12. There was a guy called Bizarre in D12. And Bizarre and Bazaar just sounded too damn similar. So I said, well, and at the time, I was at Kent State University as a freshman, and my style of rapping was super rapid and fast, and people would be like, "Man, you blitzed the track, and I was like, "Don't sound like a bad name." So that's where the Blitz comes from, and then kind of, the rest has just kind of been an evolving sense of self since then.
That's great. And I know it's been interesting, like a lot of rappers who become actors, trying to figure out sort of what name to use, and you evolving into a filmmaker, that you have this hybrid now between your rap name, like half your rap name and half your real name is like the name that you're going by. And just wondering how you settled on that. Was that just a function, or was there an intention of merging the two?
Yeah, I mean, I'd gone by Blitz the Ambassador for a decade of being a musician, and people knew me as that. And then, I get this opportunity to make film, and I was like, oh, that'd be, because everyone called me Blitz at that point, and it became like my first name anyway. So I decided, and then kind of the alliteration of that also just sounded, Blitz Bazawule just kind of worked. And so that's kind of been it. And that also allows me to still go back and be Blitz as a musician, and allows me to be Blitz Bazawule as a filmmaker.
You grew up in Accra, yes?
Yes.
I was curious for you. I ask a lot of people personally, but haven't had an opportunity to do it in any platform. So I'm actually excited to ask you this. Where do you see yourself in the legacy as someone from West Africa in the sort of transatlantic slave trade, but connected to a global Pan-African, and Black identity? Sort of how do you situate yourself in that?
That's a great one. I mean, and this is also a big tribute to my parents and how I was raised. I was always raised to understand that there was a global Black identity that existed outside of just being Ghanaian, right? And specifically Sisala as my tribe, right? And so that expansion has been ongoing. And my understanding of kind of the role in which the continental African performs in this scattered diaspora has also been quite a responsibility, knowing that, the need to connect to some sort of home, whether it's physical, ideological, revolves around continental Africans creating those pathways. So growing up, I didn't see a lot of that, and there wasn't that much. I mean, fortunately, Ghana was born out of a Pan-Africanist idea, really. If you think about Nkrumah coming to Philadelphia, being a student, going back to Ghana, independence, bringing over brilliant minds like George Patmore or W.B. Du Bois to help in the foundation. So I knew that growing up, and I knew where we fit in that space. But as an artist specifically, I did take that upon myself to say, look, if for whatever reasons, our nation states aren't still pushing that agenda, that idea of creating bridges, then the artist has to take that responsibility. So I've always seen my work as an artist. And that's also kind of going back to name and naming oneself. The ambassador part of this was always been about that. It was just to say, I recognize that there's so many fragments around how Black identity exists on the continent and in the diaspora, and the artist has to step in and create some of these bridges. So for me, whether it's in the United States, it's in Latin America, South America, it's in Europe, it's in Asia, my job is always as an artist to say, here's a pathway with which you can look back to the land in whatever form, fashion is possible. And so I've done it in film, music, fine art, like whatever venture that I've been in, that has been one consistent and constant driving force.
It's funny that, I mean, not funny, but it's great that you mentioned Nkrumah and also his time in the States and specifically in Philly, because we're definitely going to go into that because, of course, I run the Black Star Film Festival. We definitely take our cues. It is a nod to Marcus Garvey and the Black Star line, but definitely Nkrumah's use of the Black Star in the Ghanaian flag and everything that it means to Ghana, but also just this general Pan-African idea. So I wanted to also ask you, what does Nkrumah mean to you? Although I feel like you've just, sort of answered some of that, but if you had anything else to add.
I mean, I'm actually writing a book, a novel right now where he kind of plays a significant role in it. So I've been forced to kind of do a ton of research recently, on top of what I already knew. And I mean, his ideas, no matter how they ended, was so ahead of its time back then. And to think about the circumstances through which those were born, and so early, and just his understanding that, Blackness was global. It's something that I think that we have, even if we do understand that as an idea, we don't practice it as much. I think folks in that era, post-independence, knew the stakes and knew that survival was based on our connectivity. And so, Nkrumah, beyond, of course, being the liberator and our independence movement leader, is also for me an incredible spiritual guide for what we're all attempting to do, right? Which is more bridges, more understanding, more connectivity, so that we are, whenever we appear, we don't appear as fragments of ourselves, but we appear as full selves, which so many other, groups on this planet have that privilege of appearing as a united front, ideologically or physically. So that's kind of what, for me, is important. And he was an incredible beacon back then and continues to be for me, for sure.
Yeah. As a teenager, what was your focus of study? And I'm curious what made you want to come to the United States. And then also, how did you choose Kent State of all places to come to?
Yeah. So it starts for me as a visual artist. So I drew, painted throughout like elementary school years and even what we call secondary school. It was visual arts. So that's really because that was for me the most accessible at the time. And so I did that over time. And then, hip hop as a culture starts to permeate quite in a massive way. And so, Public Enemy comes to Ghana in 1992. It kind of sparks this whole, aesthetic revolution, sonic revolution. We were also listening to a lot of high life music at the time, which was our dominant, sound of that era. But so little of it was talking about some of the angst that young people were going through. It was a lot of love songs, right? And not a lot of it was dealing with our social economics and just the fact that so many of us had no real sense of how we were going to achieve our dreams. Then hip hop shows up, and then you see people who look like you, certainly on the other side of the Atlantic, but have figured out a way not only to define themselves, but to say that this is who we're going to be, and be brash about it, and be unapologetic about it, right? And so that attracted a lot of us. And if you go around the world and you see what hip hop in the 90s did for young people globally, you go to Cuba, you go to Brazil. I mean, it functioned in the same exact way. If you were black or brown, or were in any group that was considered on the fringes, hip hop was kind of your voice. It became your voice, and you adapted it. And so that was it for me. I found a lot of meaning in it, and certainly so much love for the pioneers: Kane, Rakim, Public Enemy, De La, Tribe, and there was also kind of an interesting aesthetic callback, when you look at the African medallions that were popular at the time, and the dashikis and the kufis that were in the music videos, we could also identify, and it was almost like a distant cousin saying, "I'm here too, like, pay attention." And so that was happening simultaneously to the same time that we were also trying to self-discover. Mm-hmm. And so then it became, oh, wait a second, how are they functioning? How are they doing that? Oh, they're taking old records like funk, like jazz, and they are adding these hard breaks to them. So we said, oh, well, if we took Afrobeat and high life and these records from the 60s and 70s and perhaps added these hard beats, we could also arrive at this. And one of the most incredible first people to show that it was possible was a brother called Reggie Rockstone, who's still incredibly popular in Ghana. And Reggie really is who opened our eyes. You know, he had lived in London, and I think even in the States for a brief moment. But he was the first person I saw that had taken. And so, you know, I think he's one of certainly the pioneers of hip life, which was an amalgamation of hip hop and high life. And that was life changing for me, because immediately I realized that, we can contribute to the global discourse while still contributing something that is, you know, ours, you know, to this larger part. So that is a long way to say I knew that to participate probably, and again, let's remember this is before MySpace, this is before Facebook, this is before Twitter, Instagram. You know, there was just no way that I thought that I could communicate to the diaspora, my family outside of, you know. So I was like, well, if I came to the place that was, you know, had the biggest media monopoly in the world, then it will allow for this springboard. And certainly New York was that. And prior to New York, it was, well, being also a Ghanaian, your parent wants you to have that degree. So I was like, well, I'm just going to do both. I'm going to, you know, go to whatever college. And then Kent State was the most random decision ever. There was no real thought besides I'd seen a random thing about, you know, some, you know, student protests where some shooting happened. And I was like, oh, okay, there will be some kind of activism on campus, because boy, was I wrong. I showed up and it was, you know, that was completely in the 70s and whatever. And none of that existed when I showed up to camp. And so that was just what I got. But it was also just a good education into understanding what middle America looked like, you know, and now, especially in this climate that we're in, a lot of people who live on the coast have no idea so much of what this country is, right? And that for me was a huge education. So that's how I arrived.
It's always fascinating to me to ask those stories because, you know, even myself, I think the ways that we make decisions at 17, 16, 18 years old and the impact that it eventually has. And depending on the family you come from, I had a lot of leeway and was on my own. And so like when I think about how I made those decisions, it is wild. But also, I think it also shows you when the ancestors have their hands on you because you end up exactly where you needed to be, you know?
Cool. And I would say just really, really quickly, what Kent State the blessing that Kent State ended up being was that, you know, it's a predominantly white school and super, super, super white middle America. So kind of there was this natural kind of Black studies confluence that was happening there. So kind of everyone kind of rotated into that Black studies building, which really, for me, is really where my awakening happened, you know. And the beauty of that department was that it had theater, it had literature, it had African studies, African American studies, it had everything in there. And so like if I wasn't taking a literature class, I was taking a theater class. So I was in plays, I directed, I did light, I did all those things in that department, learned a lot. Because that's another thing, you know, when you leave the continent, you're coming with like whatever the British bequeathed educationally, which so much of it just has nothing to do with us globally. And so Kent State was my education as it relates to Black people specifically in America, but also Black people globally. And that was I'm eternally grateful for. I don't think that was always the case in other campuses at the time. And so I was really lucky to be there.
Can we talk a little bit about how you made a transition from music into filmmaking? And if you also want to talk about, I mean, I think you're hinting at it, but most people probably don't understand how broad your practice is as a visual artist. You're working on a novel. You just mentioned this, you know, fomenting of some of this in college, but you have been successful in multiple disciplines as a painter. But I think I'm most interested in moving into what you're currently doing. So what was the transition from music into filmmaking?
So back in 2010, and this is maybe a little before that, I always knew, this is even before I found any real success in music. I always knew that music, because of back in the day, how things have definitely changed now, but we were very stratified and genre kind of driven, and so the chances for someone who wasn't a hip hop head to hear me was very slim at the time. And kind of with the iPod and with those changes with the internet, our tastes have expanded, and now, I mean, if you look at the average kid's device, it has music of all kinds of genres, but that wasn't the case. I mean, you remember, like, you walk into the record store and it's very segregated, and if you don't venture to the metal section at all, it's like or the rock and roll section, if you were a certain kind of person. And so that, for me, I always knew that based on whatever kind of ideas of trying to reach as a broad as possible population, I always knew the film cut across a lot more. Like, if you see, if you ask people what their favorite films are, you'll find a cross section that is a little bit more diverse than, say, music, even till today, right? So I knew that if I participated in film, my chances of getting these ideas out would be so much broader and so much more global. And so I started doing it in a very, very piecemeal way. So, like, I make a record and then I try to make a film or music videos or whatever visual accompaniment I could create. I'll do it myself, because I knew that, first of all, no one was ever going to give me money and a script to go direct something, right? So it was like I had to learn somewhere. And I also looked at my education, so-called formal education. I was like, I don't want to go to film school. Like, I'd already, going through college was enough for my parents, right? And I didn't want to, continue that. So I just knew that I wasn't going to go to film school. And so, yeah, it really just boiled down to me saying, I'm going to be doing it while I'm making music. So at some point, if I learn enough, I'll be able to take these little pieces that I've made and turn it into something. And I think, and big shouts and big love to Terrence Nance, because, us making Native Son together on that album was a big education. We went to Ghana together and made that film, and big up to Sean Peters, who came with us, and James Bartlett, who was the producer of that. And, again, just piecemeal that together, but it was huge education. So when I was making Diasporatical Trilogy at the album, I was like, okay, now I may be able to step out alone and do something with just my vision. And, but then again, I was like going back to kind of the original mission, which is, I got to make it global. I got to figure out how to communicate across with African people globally. And so, shooting in Ghana, shooting in Bahia, shooting in Brooklyn were all part of that education. And certainly big up to you guys, because it was actually programmed at Black Star. And really, it's like the first time I was like, okay, well, this thing might, it might work. I just need to go back now and figure out. And I remember, like, a few of us, surely Terrence, surely Sean, and a few of us were standing outside after a screening. I forget whose screening it was. And, we were all just talking about what we were planning to do. And this was 2016. And I remember saying, man, I'm listening to everybody talk about what they're going to do, because everybody want to show up again at Black Star with something better, and I was like, man, I got to go back. I got to go back home. I got to figure out something. So I remember it was August 2016. I just went to Ghana, and I didn't come back until, I may have showed up to play a show here and there, but I really was down there figuring out the Burial of Kojo. And all of that was really just to come back with something, because I knew everybody was going to be coming back with something. That was kind of like the beauty of that kind of competition. It's like, okay, very cool, but now I got to go work harder, come back with something great. So that was it. And then making Burial of Kojo really is, it's kind of was the springboard.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. That was a very special festival. It was the 5th one. And that's I don't know if you remember, but the power went out in the middle of a screening.
Oh yeah.
And Terrence
I remember that.
and Arthur Japhas was in that block, and it was we were just talking about it yesterday, because what was happening at the same time was a marker was being put in the ground to recognize the first enslaved Africans brought to the shores of Philadelphia. And that's what, I mean, we can't say it's what made the go out, but it happened at the exact same time. So it seems like you must have benefited from a little bit of that as well, which is incredible.
Certainly.
I wanted to bring up, I became aware of your work via Terrence and James and Chanel Pearson and, the folks who had Movement Collective. And I was curious if the collective is still intact. Do you all still see yourselves as a collective, even though everyone's careers have expanded so widely? And related to that, do you currently have a council of folks to whom you lean upon for like critique and check-in?
Absolutely. And I mean, MVMT was a family, I mean, we and it's something a lot of people don't know. Terrence Nance, myself, James, Orlando, Chanel, Natasha, we were all roommates, and so that was like, I mean, we leaned on each other in some of our lowest points and celebrated with each other at our highest points. And that hasn't changed. We're still like a family. I mean, obviously, business ventures take people into different corners of the world and all that. But to your question around family, I mean, those same people are still my lean on. Sean, I text with Sean all the time, Terrence, James, the family, always just kind of, because we're all going through similar things, maybe at different points of whatever ladder this is. We're all going through similar things. Some of us have been through it already. Some of us are just about to go into it. So we're always in touch that way. And it's always something I always advocate when I meet young creatives is, man, you got to find your family and it's got to be love, because, success and failure is going to happen over time. It's just the nature of any kind of journey, but you're going to have to find people who you love deeply and they love you deeply. And that is going to continue on. Some of us will have kids. Some of us will, things are going to, but that family is going to be your bedrock. You're always going to be able to come back to that. And so I was extremely fortunate to have met, these folks, and some of them was so random in the way we met. But overall, that family, so much of my success is a result of that family. And so that I keep that no matter what happens. And it's critical that every creative have that.
I think I heard you say that you had a uniform when you were touring as a musician, that you would make sure to wear suits. And they were often made out of Ankara. And I was curious if you also have a uniform as a director on set. Like, what is the look? How do you put on your costume to like go to work?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love uniform looks. It's like, it's for a few reasons. When I was a musician, we were traveling so much and we were playing so much, and I'd show up, and this is before 2010. So after 2010, I was like, oh, this is the look that's going to work for us. Right. But prior to that, like, I'll show up and it'll be a band playing and I'll be like, which band is that? And it could have been any band. Right. And I was just like, I don't like that. I don't like the fact that, people from afar can't tell who's up on stage. Right. And so I was just like, all right, this is how we're going to look. And we've looked that way for 10 years, right? And the same is true for directing. For directing, and this is more from a practical standpoint, it's like it's an all black regalia for me, and it's that because first of all, I go to Gap and I can buy the same thing, like 10 of them, and I don't have to do laundry. If I'm on a 10-day hustle, I don't have to do laundry, and when I jump out of bed, I don't have to think. And that for me has just been important, because there's so much, and any director knows this, your morning begins with so much problem solving. And I always want to have time to ground myself. Mm-hmm. And so the less time I spend on, anything frivolous, like look, the more time I have to ground and to figure out the challenges of the day. So, yeah, I feel like, man, throughout, Burial Kojo, it was like all black, doing Beyonce's Black is King was all black. And certainly, continuing on, it just makes life very simple for me. And I think a lot of directors have that, even if it's not a basic, it's like a set of things, it's a set look that is already dialed in. And so you just have more time to think about, your day and the challenges ahead.
Yeah. I'm always striving for that. I have not figured out my look, but I am always, always striving.
But you be having some killer shoes though. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you prep for your projects? Do you tend to mood board? Or do you have a consistent practice?
Yeah. I mean, and this is also just super grateful for my, visual art background, and I always see film as a visual medium. Certainly you have your sonics and you have other things, but it's primarily visual. And so I start first with collecting just a ton of images, right? Just things that, photographers that have shot in the vibe in which I'm looking to shoot a particular project. On Burial of Kojo, it was a lot of Alex Webb. And so like I print out, 50 Alex Webb photos, and my bedroom is literally covered in Alex Webb photos, like on the wall. So when you wake up, you're immersed, you're in that world, you're seeing what the colors are going to do. Like, so I do that, just a few months into the project, and then I storyboard excessively. That's one thing that I've always counted on because, I believe in the spontaneity of the moment, and I believe in the ancestors' hands in the work that I do. And I always leave room for that. But I'm also aware that my ancestors expect me to be ready, so that I can take full responsibility, and full advantage of what they give. And so that's been just a very key part of my prep process, and even if the scene ends up being different from how I storyboarded it, I always know where I'm starting. And for me, that's the most important. If you know where you're starting, then, you'll change, and I look at Burial and I'm like, oh man, I completely drew this in the opposite versus how I've edited it together. But it gave me a chance to know where to start, and I highly advise, there are all types of ways to do storyboards. If you can't draw, you can certainly photograph your friends in these places already, or you can draw stick figures that allow you at least to have a sense of where the camera goes and where your characters go, because that gets you into, again, the goal is to bypass all of the ancillary stuff that has nothing to do with procuring the image, the final image. And so the sooner you are able to decide on all these things, the more time you give your actors, the more time you give cinematographer, the more time you give the process in general.
Yeah. What would you say right now, and it may be too early to ask, but what is the through line or the locus of your film work?
No, I don't think it's too early. I mean, I think that I've had a viewpoint over time, and even in my short films, I always did, and certainly now, it's being able to capture, what the third eye sees, and that's difficult to explain a lot of times in this conventional setting or world. But and some will call it magical realism, some will call it, mysticism, like whatever that plane is that we know we see, and we see it in our dreams, we see it in our, I've always strived to add that element, because as an African, I'm certain that is one of the most fertile places to create from, for me, right? Certainly can't speak for the vast majority, but certainly that has been the one place that I know doesn't exist in cinematic lexicon en masse right now. And as certainly indigenous people and cultures that are much closer to the earth have just a little bit more connection to that side. And so I've always looked at my work as contributing to that part. And so everything I've done, everything from Diaspora Radical Burial, Black is King, and certainly now working on The Color Purple are all extensions of that side. And I do believe that the more we contribute to that canon, the more balance is restored in the cinematic, because it's constantly been from a very Eurocentric viewpoint, which isn't our complete story on this earth, And so a big part of that story is missing. And I speak again specifically for me. This is the corner that I know I can contribute to. So I've been intentional about that.
What do you think about this question that we've been grappling with through the Black Star Project broadly on cinema and its promise as a mode of Black cultural expression? What do you see? I think you're getting to that with your last answer, but, what is possible in the future?
I mean, I think I'll say it like this: being a musician, right, and having the privilege of practicing for a decade and having the privilege of touring the world for a decade and seeing the myriad of Black musical expression, unfettered, unhindered, and unco-opted. I know that as an expression, Black people are just beginning to express themselves cinematically. Because if you look at what we've been able to do with reggae, jazz, funk, Afrobeat, and everything else, and if you just took that as a medium, and you took film, cinema as a medium, we have not yet seen what samba in cinematic form looks like. Mm-hmm. And there's a myriad of reasons, but certainly barriers to entry is one huge one. We know that the reason we've been able to express ourselves sonically with such a breadth of style is because we've had access to the tools. You and your homies can get together and you can create something incredible. And that's how we've always done it. Cinema, however, has been a lot more difficult because of the barriers to entry. So now that the tools are becoming as available, it's inevitable that we are going to see style and freedom, specifically freedom, that has existed in our sonic expressions and certainly other artistic expressions that are, even literature. If you look at how we've written over time, it's because, with a typewriter, you can get it done. Now, how it gets published is another question, but the writing of it is accessible. Cinema hasn't always been. So now we find ourselves at this juncture where the tools are becoming liberated in a way that tools for music or tools for visual art or tools for literature have been liberated. And so we're just starting. We're just starting in terms of our contribution and the promise of being able to say, man, like, you haven't seen what we can do with this camera at all. You let one Spike Lee in, look at what he gave you. Now imagine 100, imagine 1,000, unfettered and free. And so that's where we are arriving at inevitably, because the tools are becoming more accessible, and you can already see remnants of it through things like Vine and TikTok and all these things that are just incredible, creative. We're just getting familiar with the tool, and so the minute the familiarity happens, we're going to see an incredible genre-bending approach to cinema, and it's happening though right now.
Yeah, for sure. You're listening to Mini Lumens, brought to you by Black Star.
What's up? This is Blitz, Bazawule, and you are listening to Many Lumens. Peace.
I want to talk a bit about Burial Kojo. What attracted you to its story, and what was your goal in, making this film?
Attraction was just the opportunity to show us the way I know us. I hadn't seen much of it, certainly not much of it. The way I grew up, remembering the proximity to each other, the way we moved around each other. The camera hadn't done that in my eyes yet. The way we sweat under the sun just hadn't been captured in at least not as much as I would have liked. So that was the first attraction for me, was just the possibility to just have a living testament of how I know us to be. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, again, was just from my growing up, and so a lot of where my camera was just again, memory from like hanging around my uncles and my aunties who would show up on a Sunday and gossip all day. And my vantage point of listening to that gossip, like I remember that. I remember how they smelled. I still remember the perfume they wore. Like that kind of stuff you don't forget. And I just knew that if no one who is not from there and hadn't lived through that could do that. And so I found myself in that place where I had to. So that was one. In terms of goal, honestly, I cannot say that I had a specific goal for it, except the fact that I wanted it to be seen. And I waged it with myself that no matter what happened, my film would be seen. Of course, I didn't know it would end up, thanks to Ava and the Array team, I had no idea to end up on Netflix, none of that. But I was certain, because we had achieved a feat that hadn't happened. I knew that. And so I was completely clear about the fact that it will proliferate and it will be seen. It may take 10 years to be seen. I didn't know. Those parts I did not know. But I will say that was the only goal. And everything that has come out of that has been certainly, just extra, but the goal was certainly just to make sure that this film was seen and it'll contribute to the canon.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it definitely will. I've read, and I think I also heard you talk about it as the first fully Ghanaian film. Can you explain what this means?
I mean, it, certainly from a financial standpoint, just in terms of, not financial, sorry, but more like from a funding and ideological standpoint, right? So much of what we do, especially on the continent of Africa, film-wise, is often filtered through, foreign cultural institutions, right? And they exist on the continent en masse. The goal specifically is to advance their country's whatever culture, right? And they have funding. And so what they end up doing is they end up playing gatekeeper for our stories. Not so different from what happens around the world, certainly not in America as well. So you have gatekeepers who have very little proximity to this story, this kind of storytelling, and yet have the resource. And so they decide what is made, how it's made, how far it goes. If you're going to go to Cannes, if you're going to go to TIFF, if you're going to go to somebody, it's almost impossible if your film isn't routed as an African film through these foreign cultural institutions. And so I knew that wasn't the kind of film I wanted to make. I wanted to make my film with people who know, love, approximate enough, understand, are grappling with what it means to be African in this context. And that was key for me. I had one foreigner on set who was my DP, Michael Fernandez, and much love to Michael. Because even when Michael came to Ghana, there was a level of submitting that was necessary for him to participate. Michael is Mexican, African-American, African. So, but he was the only foreigner, and that was important for me because certainly you want viewpoints as well. But again, there's a submitting that is necessary for me as an African who has lived overseas for a while. Even that is required of me as well. So there was a submitting that was necessary. The difference is that so many foreign institutions don't submit because certainly the power is skewed and they don't have to submit. So the work ends up being bland. It almost always ends up with a gaze that isn't inward. And that has been our history. And so making burial was important for me, that I would protect that. And I think that in every frame, we will stand by that frame and say that's truth. And that's not because this other person sees it this way. It's because this is how we see it. And that for me is important.
Yeah. You filmed on location in Accra and cast local actors. Can you talk a little bit about how you found your cast and crew?
It was rough. Yeah. I mean, because, again, I was making a film in 2016. We shot in 2017. There was so little experience. There was a lot of talent, but there was very little experience. And so kind of I had to start. It was like building a building from the foundation up. And I had to educate myself, but I also had to educate everyone who was going to be involved with this. So we had to watch everything. We all learned each other's jobs. I learned how to produce. My producer learned how to cast. I mean, we all learned. And that, for me, is probably the most important legacy that the Burial of Kojo has, is that it showed a few things. It showed that, one, internally, we can do it ourselves. Because prior to that, there hadn't been much shot in Ghana. Certainly the last project that was shot in Ghana before we shot was Beast of No Nation. Beast of No Nation, starring Idris, directed by Kerry Fukunaga, where all external, pre-produced, prefabricated structures that arrived in Ghana. So a lot of people don't see how it's put together. My team learned how to fund. My team learned how to protect each other's safety. We learned so many things, and then certainly the icing on the cake was crowdfunding, which I'm still incredibly indebted to our community for that contribution on Kickstarter, which allowed us to get to the finish line. But it exposed us all to the fact that we could do it ourselves, and so it was a local investment. It was a local scouting. Looking for people who had the right heart, maybe not the experience, but knowing that if put in that position, they will hold. And it's been incredible for me to see so many of them continue on to work and work on very high level productions. It's incredible for me to see, my cast, Cynthia, specifically the young girl who played AC and Joseph, who played Kojo, have so many opportunities now globally. They're part of this global family of cinema now, and I'm incredibly proud to have achieved that. And if nothing at all, to have shown that internally we always had what it took. We just needed to get it together, and that was it.
You've collaborated with Michael Fernandez, who you just mentioned, as DP on this film, but also worked with him before, and you worked with him before Burial, right? Or was that your first collaboration?
Yeah. No, but he hadn't shot for me. He did color. He did color on the Aspiratical trilogy of Bahia shoot. Okay. So he did a color grading.
And then you had him work with you on Beyonce's Black is King as well. And I was curious, how did you meet, and what is it about his style and approach to cinematography that appeals to you?
Well, Michael had a similar journey as me. He's a musician, and so, I think we all look at film in a very similar way. We all look at visuals in a very lyrical way, and that lyricism and that pacing was important for me to find someone who understood that. And on Burial of Kojo, we kind of learned to trust each other as friends, as brothers, and certainly on Black is King, it was an expansion of that, right? It was, oh, now we have a little bit of a budget now. Okay, now we can do these kinds of scenes that we never had access to do. And then again, this might sound really, but, and even when I made music, I've always looked to people's hearts first, like that has always been the most important thing for me as a creative, because talent is subjective, and what people's abilities, it's, what good is the best cinematographer who doesn't believe in that frame? What good is that? It's not going to carry over. What good is a Juilliard trained guitarist who doesn't believe in the sound, whose heart isn't open to the sound? You're not going to achieve that. And so, and I know it's very unconventional because we live in a very Euro skewed world that looks to your like whatever your CV or resume says, right? But I look past that, because I think at the end of the day, everyone with the basics can achieve it. You know what I mean? Anyone can set up a camera and shoot. If you know how to press on and off, you can film a scene. It's not, but to communicate is a heart thing. You know what I mean? And that I've never been able to do that with people who don't have the kind of heart that I'm attracted to. You know what I mean? And so that has always been my philosophy around who I bring around me, and I know that in time, if you've got the right heart and you've got the right spirit, we're going to achieve it. It maybe not in one shot, but over time we will achieve it because our intentions are pure. And that's how, I cast. That's how that's how I find musicians. That's how I find that's how we find friends. Let's start there. The friends that are it's people who are connected from a heart space. And that's why my friends stay my friends, for a long time. It's because of that. And so I don't change that on just because it's a professional endeavor. I think it's the same thing. I think you're going to get more out of each other, especially on your difficult days, right? So that's a long way to say that's what I saw in Michael. And Michael Scott, I love that brother. You know what I mean? It's just, it was just, we understood what we were trying to say. And that's why the work achieves what it achieves.
Barry of Kojo, of course, is not like the zenith of your career in any way. You've been winning for a while, even before Hollywood has sort of come to you. You're a Guggenheim and a TED Fellow. You were awarded the Vilcek Prize for Contemporary Music, participated in the Whitney Biennial. You won at Urban World and at Luxor. As you pivoted into Hollywood, directing television and scheduled to direct the adaptation of the musical The Color Purple, I'm curious if this was at all what you envisioned for your career at this stage.
I wouldn't say envisioned, right? And I've always tried my very best not to pin my goals in specificity, right? I go for the largest, broadest goal, which is I want to be comfortably making my art. I want to work with people I love that love me. And I want to tell incredibly adept stories that allow me to be an artist. Somehow, when you make those goals and you go for the essence of them rather than the specific, because when my challenge, I wouldn't say my challenge, my issue around saying, yeah, I want to make a Hollywood film is because then it in a way undermines everything else you make. So it's less about I want to make a Hollywood film as much as it's about I want to make a film just with more people and more people that love me. That's just it. That, and cool. If that's a Hollywood film, fantastic. If it's an indie film that that's I've got some more resources to do, that's fantastic. And so that's just been it for me. And I think that just by pivoting in this space, things have naturally happened, but I learned this from making music. It was the same, it wasn't ever, I want to play, trans musical in Rennes, France. So I want to play Afro punk in Johannesburg. It was never that for me. It was always, I want my music to communicate in its realest, truest way to as many people as possible. And then somehow your phone rings and someone says you should show up in France, or someone says you should show up in Japan. And you start to find that it's happening, right? I teach from time to time, and I tell my students a lot. It's about creating these larger goals that are about the essence of what you want, rather than specific categories, because the way the world is stratified, first of all, isn't natural. So the minute you start narrowing these gaps, the further they get away from you, because that's just the way it's structured. And so, yeah, I mean, and I will say, just keeping that open mind and heart has just always just gotten me one step closer. You know what I mean? And I don't want much. You know what I mean? I just want us to have more access to each other. That's it. And so naturally, yeah. I mean, certainly Burial of Kojet Landon on Netflix wasn't, it's part of this larger goal. Yes. But it achieves the essence of the goal, which is now globally, more people have access to this work, which is what I think, especially in this creative environment, we should do more of.
Yeah. To talk about The Color Purple just a little bit, what are you listening to or looking for? And basically, like, how are you dreaming, envisioning your approach to this, if you want to share it all?
Really not much to share right now. It's still very early in that process. But what I'm doing is just not doing what I've always done. It's the same thing for me. Listening more and more to music that feels like the vibe. I did it on Burial, did it on Black is King, same. Watching more and more that feels like the vibe, and meditating. That's the same thing that I've always done. So, yeah, that's it.
Yeah. You're the founder of Africa Film Society, which does many things, including running a monthly screening event called Classics in the Park, which you've been doing since 2016, where you screen classic African cinema for free, sometimes with filmmakers present. What was the impetus in starting the society and the series?
Yeah, well, it revolved around the fact that I found that I wasn't educated at all as it relates to African film. I hadn't seen enough. I didn't know the filmmakers, and it's by design, that we just don't have access to our own. So we always think we are inventing the wheel, when in fact we should be thinking about the motor or the engine. So I found myself in that position, and I thought to myself, well, if I didn't know this, then certainly most of my friends didn't know this. And if most of my friends didn't know this, then certainly the larger population didn't. And so when I went to Ghana to make Burial, I found that, I was educating myself and my team. As I was saying earlier, I mean, we had to learn how to do everything. I didn't think it was wise to begin without looking back as to who's done what prior. So certainly having a chance to watch Usman Simbene or Jibril Diop Mambeti or Kwao Ansah or any of these incredible filmmakers, Safi Faye from Senegal. And, it's just like having that chance to see, a myriad of these films, which were made under a lot more strenuous circumstances than we were, was for me, I think, important. And then that gift is just kind of was like, well, then let's take it from our office. Only 10 of us can fit in here to watch this. Let's take it out in the park. And I remember growing up, one of the biggest outdoor is before like a lot of us had televisions in our homes. We certainly didn't growing up. One of the biggest things that pulled us were the evangelicals who will come out and show Jesus movies in the park for free. So I knew that was effective because I remember, we waited on that, So I've seen Last Temptation of Jesus Christ 20 times because that would show up and we'll all take our mats or our stool and we'll go outside and we'll wait for the car to set up. And I'll go early and I'll watch how they'll set up the projector, they'll set up the screen. And the screens were attached to the vans that did the crusades. We call them crusades, right? And at the end, the pastor will come and would convert the whole park, and then a week later they'll come and convert everybody again. But that was just the way it worked. And so I knew that it was an effective way of getting out ideas and images. And till this day, I remember, visually at least, what the Last Temptation of Jesus Christ looks like, feels like. So my thing was, well, if we just took their mantra and their system, then we will be able to reach a lot of people. And it's been great. I mean, this year, certainly because of COVID, we had to fall back, but we are looking forward to getting back to programming next year.
That's wonderful. You're also still, as you mentioned earlier, exploring other mediums. So you're working on a novel. You recently had paintings on view at Fridman Gallery as part of Open Arts Young Artist One exhibit. Those paintings were inspired by found photographs from markets around the world, which I really appreciate because that for me was just still referencing your ambassador goals. And also I wanted to note the paintings are all sold out. So I'm just curious for you, is there a medium that you have not approached that you're interested in exploring? And also if there's any plan to return to music?
Yeah. I mean, I've always just over time, really, and I think this is just the way I was raised, man. I get restless very quickly, in spaces generally, So I've never lived anywhere too long. I move around. I find inspiration in different cities, different towns. I've just been that kind of person, and so my art has followed that path where I don't even think I'm intentional necessarily about what artistic style I want to go into next. I mean, I really sometimes just stumble into doing it. I hadn't painted, for instance, in years. And when COVID hit and I couldn't tour, I couldn't shoot, I couldn't do much, I was just like, well, let me just get my canvas out and see if I still remember how to do it, and I turned out that I did well enough to sell out all the pieces I made, and now my phone won't stop ringing. And I'm like, but I'm not really a painter though, not yet at least, and so I never really, I never really go, okay, it's time to make music, it's time to make film. I've really always thought about it as, the season and what I want to say at the time. Certainly what I wanted to say in 2016, 2017 was this visual capture of what I remember as my beautiful growing ups and the magical worlds in which my grandmother's stories affected my life personally. And I knew that that's what I wanted to say. And there was no way I could have said it in music form only. I could have only said those things in feature film. I couldn't even have said it in short film form. I needed to say it in feature film form. So for me, it's less been about medium, and it's really been about what I want to say at the moment. And what I want to say at the moment has been that I think about, that I ponder on and I meditate on. But the best medium in which it takes, I never really do the math on that. I wake up and I go, well, I guess I gotta make some songs, because this thing I want to say, only through music can I say it, and that's one thing I wish for every creative everywhere. It's just that you have an unbridled, unfettered access to all your creative engines, and you are free enough to practice them how you see fit and when you see fit.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to work on, Queen of All Queens, Beyonce, along with other directors like Jen and Kiru and Emmanuel Adjei on Black is King? I mean, that's a lot of creatives as director, so what was that experience like for you? And I think also specifically, the tricky thing about Black is King as a project to me is that I think for so long we have tried to not essentialize or romanticize the continent of Africa and having this like synonymous relationship to the animal kingdom, right? Like safaris and all of that notion. But then this project is essentially doing that, but obviously for the narrative structure to mimic The Lion King, which is this other story. And so how did you, as a contemporary African artist, take this challenge and meet it? I mean, it's a really, really incredible one.
That is where it started, right? It started for me. My when I was called for this project, that was the one thing that I knew would be my core contribution, would be figuring out how we move away from this being socialized to see the continent of Africa as a nonstop safari to a place where human beings live, who go through their challenges and their triumphs. And so, when I was called for the gig, that was like my pitch. My pitch was just like, look, I want to go to South Africa, because I knew that I will get the two worlds. They have an incredibly robust traditional life and a very contemporary, modern urban life. And so I knew that I would get those two polar opposites. And I did a ton of storyboards to show B, and she liked the idea and said, "Go for it." And so, it was a challenge, but it was an incredible one. I mean, such a blessing. One, to have the resources, but two, also to have the musical soundscape of Beyonce to work from. I mean, that's something that people don't even think about. Like that's where this is born out of, because the album was a story as well. So that's where we drew almost everything, and my job was to cast in South Africa, to find these incredible visual moments, that were going to tell the story. So everything from, where our Simba now is a young adult and is in this hearse losing his mind, when he gets blessed and levitates in this crazy building. Like, those things were all part of things that I've already wanted to say, about our lives. And then this was just a perfect bridge to do that. And, Beyonce was very adamant about the magical realist element that we could add to this story, elevate it. I brought in ideas around the celestial, which were like the Dogon tribe, and how, our king is looking to the stars, and certainly, this could be a nod to this tribe. And so some of the symbolism and insignia was also important, because we also knew that, this is something that, my son is 11 years old. This stays imprinted in his mind forever as it relates to the continent. And so the same way that the original Lion King is imprinted in my mind, for as long as I live. And so that was it for me. It was just finding these incredibly powerful moments that I could work from. And then as it relates to working with a larger directorial team, I mean, you mentioned those names, and we're talking high-level, brilliant, global minds that all came together. And for me, it's like being on Dream Team 1992 Barcelona Olympics. It's like everyone, this shit hits the backboard and it's getting dunked. There was no question around. So again, when you're working in that field, you also don't feel like you don't, first of all, you don't have to carry all the water. You know what I mean? Like, you just know that if you carry your part, Jen will carry hers and make you look good. Ibra will carry his, like Beyonce will carry hers. There was just so much brilliance all around us, and so I was very fortunate to be in that space. And it was also just an affirmation of the same thing I've talked about from the beginning, is just knowing that our job is to reach as many people as possible. That's just the job, you know? And so we don't know where that call is going to come from. We don't know what platform is going to live on. We don't know any of that. However, I've just stayed true to that notion that if I just keep going, if I keep the goal of expanding at whatever rate, you know, 'cause sometimes it fluctuates. Sometimes you play 1,000 people. Sometimes you come back to playing 100. Just sometimes you play 10. It's just, you know, just knowing that all of that adds up to this larger goal. And I mean, for the millions of people who saw Black is King, I mean, that is a gift. That's a gift.
I had a question for you about your son, and curious as an artist, how raising him has impacted your practice. And I'm curious, A, how he influences you, and B, what does he think of your work?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, I mean, any parent will tell you this, right? It's like your kids become your inevitable checks and balances, right? It's like everything that you do, you're being watched, right? How you handle those phone calls, how you handle yourself in those meetings, if they're there with you, how, you know, especially in this version of our world right now where he's homeschooled. I mean, he's schooling from home and I'm working from home, and it's like they're part of your world, you know? And so that's incredible. But it also, so first from an ideological perspective, it's also given a lot more meaning to my work, because I know that him and his peers, like there's a tangible, like I'm not talking about some proverbial kids who need to see this. I'm talking about my son, who I sit in front of the television with him to watch Black is King, to watch The Burial of Kojo. That's specific. I'm talking to him specifically, right? So that's been incredibly important, because it's also put a level of responsibility on me, where it's like, man, what I choose is important. How I choose is important. How I work at it is important, because he's watching everything. And then how he feels about my work, it's very interesting. So up until so my son has this thing where he's like, yeah, Dad, you know, yeah, your raps are whatever. Like he's not like a big, you know, he's not a fan of my raps. Likes my films a little. Certainly Black is King, yes, because, you know, it's Beyonce. So, you know, he likes that. But what surprised me was just when he saw my paintings, and he was like, wow. And it's very interesting because, you know, for kids, like that is magic.
They don't lie.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely don't lie. But it's the most direct talent he's, you know, I don't say talent, but creative expression he's seen, where it's like my brush touches the canvas and he sees art. With film, it's like, all right, maybe it's the camera. Maybe my dad's not nice like that. Maybe it's the mic, or maybe it's the beats, you know? So it's not as direct, but I think so it's been very interesting to watch how much he loves my paintings. And actually, when I had to ship them out for sale, he wasn't so excited about that. But it's very interesting to see how just kids, like what they gravitate to and such. But he also definitely keeps me, like, I'm abreast, you know what I mean? Like he's one of the kids that's up on everything, up on what the kids like, why they like it, you know, and he can articulate those things, you know, to me, why that works. And so, man, it's a huge blessing to be a working artist and a parent. You really get some direct feedback. And like you said, they don't lie.
Yeah. You have talked this entire time about all of the things that you're doing, and it feels nonstop to me. And I am curious where you find refuge. You know, how does Blitz chill? How do you reset?
I am intentional about taking my breaks. They don't seem to the outside world that they happen. But they do, because I also don't believe in burning out. You know, I think that we have such a marathon to run, and self-care is critical. And Like, I try very much to not do much, like when I'm not doing the most, like I don't go out. I don't do nothing. I'm chilling, and so that has been a huge, but I learned that from touring, I learned that from being on the road, playing 5 nights, a week, jumping from plane to plane. If you don't find your times to reset, because that audience doesn't care that you just flew on the red eye, from New York to, I don't know, Amsterdam. They don't care. They pay that money and they got to see brilliance. So I learned that being able to being disciplined enough to reset and not, you don't need to crash before you find out that you need that. Has been incredibly important. I meditate. I take my time. You know what I mean? I take my time in the mornings. I don't rush through it. I take my time in getting my days off the ground. And again, because I feel like I'm at my best if I'm in my most relaxed, in my best self. And so. Yes, I mean, and again, knowing how to schedule, in ways. So I work with the overlap system a lot. Like it doesn't have to end for me to start. I know how to take a break in between. And so while it's out, I know how to take my break while it's out so that, and look, our work is expansive and not enough of us are doing the work. So a few of us do the work of the many. And that may have always been the case. I do not know, but certainly I can say that for this era, a few of us do the work of the many, So it is important that we burn on as many cylinders as possible, because the more diverse in our conversation, the more of us the more of that work we can do. But within that, cylinders firing, is also the ability to kind of restrain. That party sound good, but I'm not, I can't hang, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm always missing like the amazing Black Star parties just because I'm like, yo, I love this, but your boy gotta go, because if I don't, then it builds up. And then before you realize, it's affecting the same work that you want to do. Right. And so I'm really about self-care and rest, man. That is a must for us doing the work. It is critical that we rest.
That's a really beautiful place to end. I also am going to hold on to, I just took notes of this poll between the most and not much. So I love that imagery. But yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Many Lumens. Visit us at manylumens.com to subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Many Lumens. Many Lumens is brought to you by Black Star. This episode was produced by Patrice Worthy and Farah Rahaman, edited by David Adams, and engineered by Mike Mihalik. Our music supervisor is Rashid Zakat. Our theme song was composed by Vijay Mohan and remixed by David DJ Little Dave Adams. Sending you light, and see you next time.